Today in the EU elections, the final projections before the vote. Today is the first day of the European elections, with EU citizens heading to the polls to determine who will be seated in the new European Parliament. Just before the elections, we present the latest projections from our polling partner, Europe Elects, on voting trends, percentages, and the seats the parties may gain. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To break down the numbers and the tendencies, we invited Tobias Gerhard-Schminke, CEO and founder of Europe Elects, to our studio. Tobias, we are talking today about the last batch of projections from Europe Elects. We've been doing this for the past 4 months already, and now the day has come. What do the last projections show?
So the projections have been relatively stable recently in the sense that the centre-right EPP group of Ursula von der Leyen has quite a comfortable lead of about a quarter of the seats. And then we have second, the centre-left, which has around 140 out of 720 seats. And then we had an interesting race over the third spot between the Liberals, the National Conservatives and the right. But now that the right has been falling apart, it looks like the Liberals will come third. And then after those three groups that I just mentioned, the Greens and the left trailing behind.
They're trying to catch up. And how did you gather the data that we've been reporting all this time?
So we're sourcing it from publicly available sources. We're not the ones who ask people who they would vote for. We take this from publicly available sources. Other pollsters have asked people who they would vote for. We just aggregate this on the European level. Who's we? We're a team of 118 people behind Europe Elects, and we gather this data, review it, make sure that we don't fall for fake news, etc.
What is the most surprising trend according to you, and why?
So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Maybe one trend that everybody talks about is the rise of the right, right? It's not really a surprise, but since the 90s, we've been seeing that radical right parties who are really against non-European immigration and who don't believe so much in climate change has been on the rise. And that has been continuing, and it will likely continue now during the European elections. Not really surprising, but there are some smaller interesting trends that are often being overlooked. For example, we now see that the Green parties, while they overall decline, are a bit more successful in Eastern Europe. That's a novelty. So that's something interesting. A lot of people from the European bubble probably are listening to us. There's this party called Volt Europa, which is a European federalist party. And we are now projecting that they're going to get 4 seats, so 4 times more. Last time they only had 1. I thought that would be an interesting fun fact for the European bubble.
Yeah, that shows a big growth. But when you analyze the data, do you also analyze the factors of how people choose to vote? You mentioned that the Easterners are voting more Green now, so...
There are general trends of why people change the way they vote. So in 2019, the European Greens had a great time during the campaign because they were held by the Fridays for Future protests. People were very concerned about climate change in general. It was on everybody's mind. This time it's a little bit different. Today we have the farmers' protests here in Brussels. The cost of living crisis, not just for the farmers, but for everybody else is important. We have the war in Ukraine, which is on everybody's mind. So the Greens have a harder time putting climate change to the front of the campaign, and this probably does not help them in the polls.
Do you think the data that you've been gathering on EU level is also what is happening nationally? You know, a good example is the rise of the far right that we've been talking about on an EU level, but we also saw this trend on a national level with the Netherlands and other countries as well. So is there a connection?
Absolutely. So we have interesting national trends when it comes to the rise of the radical right. For example, one country that will see an enormous rise of the radical right, according to current polls, is France. So Marine Le Pen will likely become by far the strongest party with the Rassemblement National, more than 30% in current polls. And we have another right-wing party in France now with Éric Zemmour, Reconquête. Together they will receive 35% of the vote, versus before the radical right had about 20-25%. So that's quite an increase. You already mentioned Geert Wilders' party in the Netherlands. Last time, what many people forget, they didn't even win one single seat. Now they will become likely the strongest party. And also in Germany, the AfD will be stronger than usual. So we see this European trend of radical right parties rising on the national level, and in particular in some countries, like I just described.
And we've been talking a lot about big parties losing seats this time around. How do you see this panning out? Will the difference be big when compared to the data of 2019?
So when we compare the election result of 2019 and today, we see that we have 2 winners and 2 losers.
Who is the bigger winner and loser?
The 2 winners are the 2 radical right groups that we currently have, likely. Marine Le Pen's group, the Identity and Democracy group, will likely gain a bit. We're talking about 2 percentage points of the seats. And Giorgia Meloni's ECR group will also likely gain 1 or 2 percentage points compared to last time. That isn't massive, but if you take it together and you add the disorganized or unorganized right-wing parties that are not part of this group, but just do their own thing in the non-inscrits, we have a rise of the radical right about 5 percentage points, which takes them to having about a quarter of the seats. So the radical right is really the winner, most likely, according to our projections. And the 2 losers are socially progressive groups, which is the Greens and Renew Europe, the liberal group. The Greens will likely lose because they have a really hard time in their stronghold in Germany. And the liberals, because Emmanuel Macron was quite successful in the 2019 election. He was still in a new phase, but he's struggling now. And this will impact the liberals.
Now, in the coming days, exit polls will reveal how the country is voted. Will they match our current projections? How reliable is our pre-vote data?
There are 2 important dimensions about this. The first one is voters change their mind, and especially in the days before the election, they may change their mind. And pollsters cannot capture this, polls cannot capture this, which means we cannot capture it. So you looked at the projections, but I still encourage you to follow the elections because it's going to be super interesting and there will be surprises because voters change their mind. Then the second dimension is that the national parties organize into the groups after the election. So Europe Elects gathered a lot of intelligence on who they want to join. We spoke to the parties, we spoke to the groups in the European Parliament, but they may change their mind. And a lot of them still don't know who they're going to join. So we have, for example, the ECR, which has a lot of options right now. They could in parts unite to a certain degree with the centre-right EPP. We have the scenario that they unite with Marine Le Pen, or they will remain an independent group. We don't know. I don't think they will know. And then there are also some dynamics in the sense that the ECR has options of either cooperating with one party or the other, but it's impossible to do it with both. And they will wait to see what is going to happen after the election. And many groups operate like this, but it's especially important for the ECR.
Right, but how much can we rely on exit polls? Should we keep an open mind, or the numbers we're seeing now will be the ones that we will see after the vote counting?
That's a super interesting question today because India had exit polls yesterday or the day before, and they showed a big victory for the radical right. And today the results are coming in and it looks like the victory is actually not that big. So that was quite a surprise. But in Europe, exit polls are usually quite reliable. But I encourage people to still keep an eye, especially those interested in politics, for the final results.
And you mentioned a bit the coalitions. Who do you see being excluded from this possibility?
So one group that has no real option to get immediate power is the left, but also the Identity and Democracy group will have a really hard time. So the party on the far right of Marine Le Pen.
Why?
Because they probably have the most radical ideas, and currently Europe is quote-unquote governed by a centrist quote-unquote coalition. That means the liberals, the Christian Democrats and the socialists work together, have been historically working together, and they occasionally cooperate with their group to the immediate left, which is the Greens, and the immediate right, which is the ECR on certain issues. But the ID group and the left group are more radical and hence more ideological, removed from the governing center. So they will probably have a harder time of bringing their issues into parliament and finding a majority.
And what about the collaborations between countries, especially in the case of AfD, who's now expelled from ID? So what can we expect on this?
I read a report in the Hungarian RTL recently that spoke of AfD meeting with Mihazang in Hungary, which is a far-right, actually a neo-Nazi party, specifically to find partners across Europe that they can cooperate with. Now, Mihazang might or might not enter the European Parliament, so there's a big question mark. But we can look to Greece, where we have Niki, right? This is a far-right Orthodox political party that they could cooperate with. We have in Slovakia the Patriot Party that they could cooperate with. We have in Bulgaria actually a far-right party whose name I cannot pronounce, but it's abbreviated with a V. And they encouraged AfD to create their own group because they have a recent similar experience in the sense that they were about to join the ID party, but they then got kicked out in the process because some of their representatives met with folks in Moscow. So there's already a handful of folks who might be interested in cooperating. Maybe they will be able to get one or two parties from the ID group. We don't know. But this is the options for the possible AfD group.
And on the other spectrum, on the left, who do you see coming together?
So the left, and I just pulled this up here in front of me. For example, the Slovak party Hlas, which means voice in English, of the now president-elect Peter Pellegrini, which has a similar ideological profile in the sense that they're left-wing economically, but socially more conservative. Then also in Greece, we have the Course of Freedom party, and you can pronounce how that's called in Greek.
Plevs Eleftherias.
Is that the party of Zoe Konstantopoulou?
Konstantopoulou, yeah.
Perfect. So similar profile, I would say. Stabilité in Latvia is another option. This is somewhat of a quote-unquote Russian minority party. I don't like the term, but essentially they are quite supported by the Russian minority there. So we could see that they work together. But we don't really know. But there are other partners who could join to make it work. We recently presented on our website that the Labour Party in Lithuania could join that group. But I received from credible sources that they will for sure not join. But long story short, the BSW claims that they already have the people they need for a group in the European Parliament.
Okay, so I'm thinking that these groups are small. So what influence or power will these groups have in Parliament?
The interest of creating a group is probably that it comes with more rights, financially influenced talking time. But will they be actually influencing legislating new laws? Probably not, because they're so on the fringes, so excluded. I don't see that they will have a huge policy influence.
And what about the turnout? What can we expect there?
It will be interesting to see whether the turnout will rise again. Just a reminder, in 2019, we saw that turnout rose for the first time in a European election. After almost 40 years of elections, finally, turnout increased. More people went to the polls. We hope that we will see that again this time. And to make that possible, maybe take a friend to the polling booth. If you're hearing this, call your parents and your siblings and make sure they vote.
And Tobias, what is your gut feeling about the results of the elections?
My gut feeling is that the centrist coalition will likely continue, but the EPP will have more options to play their partners against each other. We saw that in the summer of 2019, the EPP cooperated with the radical right to water down a biodiversity law. If the radical right becomes stronger, the EPP will have an easier time to cooperate with the radical right to do what they did last summer. At the same time, they still cooperate with the Liberals and the Social Democrats, so they can kind of bargain between the two groups and say, listen, if you don't give us what we want, we can work with the others. And that goes both ways. So that's something interesting. And then maybe one last interesting thing that not many people talk about is also that the AfD in Germany is planning to create their own group. So that would be to the right of Marine Le Pen. If they're smart, they could find the partners, in my opinion. We need 23 MEPs from 7 countries. And the same goes for the Movimento Cinque Stelle from Italy that has been in contact with the BSW from Germany. So we could see a new left conservative group. Again, if they're smart about it, they will be able to manage to bring that together, I think. But we'll see if they're smart.
Thank you very much, Tobias. We will speak with you again after the last exit polls on Sunday night. I am Evi Kiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review or a comment on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, and this episode was produced by Miriam Saenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yonta, and myself. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.